Hello, everybody. Welcome to this stream. Whether you are listening live or on record, you're very welcome. I'm really grateful that you're joining today. And I hope that God's grace and peace are with you wherever you are. I'm very excited to share with you today about the town of Darvell, which is in East Sussex in England, and it exists today. Before I get into what the town of Darvell is like, I just want to give a bit of background to why I'm interested about this and why I dug into it. A couple of weeks ago, there's a YouTuber called the Academic Agent, and he's got a reasonable following on the online internet right. And he produced a couple of videos on what he describes as a positive vision for the online right. In some ways, this might be a slightly misleading title. And it's part of the reasons why his videos have caused such a stir, is this designation of right wing is somewhat distracting. Rather, really what the Academic Agent wanted to do is present a model of, is there an alternative to the way we're living now? Can we live in a better way? Many people recognize that there are deep problems with what modernity has done to humanity, with how the modern liberal Western societies, what they're doing to people. Anxiety and depression are at record highs. People are dying by suicide far more than they were in the past. We're more isolated than we once were. At the same time, social mobility, while it seems on the surface good, has undermined our sense of stability and community. Moreover, whether we're capitalist or communist or socialist or something in between, everything seems to be structured around the accumulation of wealth and the production of growth. That seems to be the end of society, material accumulation. And this doesn't seem right. The problem that many of us face is that we live in societies where there is nobody to hold accountable for these things. As Hannah Arendt has kind of described it, we live as if we're ruled by nobody, but that doesn't mean we're not ruled by anybody. Rather, we live under great bureaucracies, what James Burnham called the managerial class. And it's suffocating. It seems impossible to escape their control. What Academic Agent was trying to do was outline a vision of a society which is organized based on other principles, a different way of life, which is a reaction against modernity and Western liberal society in order to try and address some of these issues, to address some of these problems. So, in his vision, we find a community which is like a 21st century version of feudal society. It's static. So people, their families have a certain employment, and these vocations serve the community. They're only things that are necessary for the community to survive. For example, you may have a baker, and your baker, he has that job for his whole life, and he trains up his son to be a baker, and so on. And there's various of these jobs. This is under a hierarchy where you have a mayor who's the mayor for life, and various other positions which cultivate this or run this town. It's an isolated town. What do I mean by that? Well, it's cut off essentially from the outside world. There is very little interaction with the rest of the world, except through official channels which are controlled by the authorities. People don't have social media. They probably don't have televisions. They only get their kind of life in this town. This ties in with a broader point for the Academic Agent, which is that technology only need be at a minimum. There is no need to have social media because you only need what you need to survive. Your fulfillment comes through work, through the value of work. And this is a very Carlylean point. There is a real, that is what we are made for, to work. And so you get your meaning through that. It's run based on traditional values. These are loosely defined by him, kind of implied as to what they might mean, but we can imagine it means kind of what you might call a classical Christian sexual ethic, traditional family structures being the heart of the community. And anybody who deviates from these is severely punished. They are probably thrown out of the community. Membership is all or nothing. You cannot be in or out, both in or out, I should say. You're either fully into this community or you're excluded. Fundamentally, this town is based on spiritual principles. This wasn't immediately clear to most people in Academic Agent's first video, but in his, I think it was his third, he tried to outline this, that rather than focusing on economic wealth or ideas of progress, this town is ordered according to a perennial traditionalist approach. And fundamentally, what that means is that taking the essence from all kinds of traditional religions and societies to establish the order of a community, and that involves a hierarchical structure with traditional morals and so on. Now, Academic Agent's vision, which I would encourage you to check out yourselves if you haven't, I've put the links in the description, garnered a lot of different responses, quite surprisingly, a lot of strong negative reactions from people who characterize themselves as right-wing. There was quite a few that we can look at. The first is that Trumpton, which is what he called this town, is not right-wing enough. This came from a number of different sectors. Now, in this stream, we're not going to get into the question of whether it's right-wing or not, because that's besides the point. Everybody's got their own definition of what's right-wing. What really matters is, does Trumpton or AA's positive vision really address what's wrong in our society? Does it work? Is it better? Is it a true alternative? This leads to another point. Many people said this is really an infeasible thing. It's never going to happen. It couldn't exist in the modern world for two reasons. One, we couldn't live without the level of technology we have today. And second, it would be shut down by the government or by a foreign power. It would be invaded by China, let's say. And Academic Agent recognized himself that although a foreign power is unlikely to invade a small town in England, the British government may try to shut it down, send in the police, or in America, the FBI or something like that. A third kind of objection was that it is too authoritarian, that this level of control over the flow of information and of economics. I should have said earlier that there would be no encouragement to grow your capital in this town. It would be a kind of equilibrium. This kind of control over the economics and freedom of the people is far too authoritarian, and it is more akin to a socialist state than it is to any right-wing view. Again, there's problems about just categorizing it as the bad guys rather than the idea itself. But it may be too authoritarian in some people's views. A fourth area, and tied into this, is the problem of the youth. What happens when people grow up who don't want to be part of this society anymore? Academic Agents' kind of system basically leads to them being totally thrown out. This is problematic, people argued, because the youth tend to rebel, or at least that seems to be the case, that young people rebel against the system. So what are you going to do about young people when they rebel against this authoritarian, homogenous town? So in this video, I want to look at Darville, which is a town in the East Sussex of England. And I want to look at it because I think it helps us get to grips a bit better with Trumpton. It's not identical with Trumpton. There's many things which are different, and they'll become apparent as we go through what Darville is like. But what it can do for us is by giving us a concrete example of something very much like Trumpton or akin to it, or to its essential core values, we can show that it's feasible to live in a traditional town or village in modern day Britain. So the objection that it's not feasible to do this is reacted against or disproven. Moreover, through looking at Darville, we can try to improve certain aspects of academic agent's positive vision. It may be in ways he disagrees with or you disagree with. I'd be interested to hear them. But I think there's room for improvement on a number of issues that were raised against Trumpton, which Darville maybe gives us an insight into. It also can help us see the practicalities of something like this. We have a real living example of traditional society and its pros and cons as a result. So no longer is this just an abstract discussion. We can really engage with something in real life, which I think is very helpful for anchoring these sorts of discussions. So without further ado, I'll get into it. So let me share my screen and give you a picture of what Darville looks like. So this is the village of Darville, and it is the home to a community called the Bruderhof. Now, the Bruderhof means, in German, it means community of brothers. The Bruderhof are a religious movement. They were founded by Eberhard Arnold in the 1920s. Now, Arnold was an Anabaptist, or from the Anabaptist tradition. That means that he believed in believer's baptism rather than infant baptism, and was a kind of evangelical Protestant in the German meaning of that word. The Anabaptists emerged during the Reformation. They broke off from the magisterial Reformation of Luther and Calvin, were led by people like Munster. So Arnold in the 1920s was dissatisfied with his life and decided to, he felt that it wasn't following Jesus's commandments fully enough. And he felt that about modern society in general. And so basing his vision on the description of the early church in Acts 2, he attempted to found a community. And he did so with about 150 people in total. In 1937, this community in Samet was disbanded at gunpoint by the Nazis, who dismantled the Bruderhof because they refused to do the Heil Hitler. They refused to acknowledge the Nazi regime, and they wouldn't allow a government official to teach the town's children. However, while many were arrested, they managed to escape, and they moved to England in 1940. However, when war broke out, they were forced again to leave because the Germans would have been under detainment during the war, so they went to Paraguay. However, 3 of its members remained in England, and this is the basis for the community at Darville today. Today, the Bruderhof number 3,000 members in 23 settlements around the world, including in the States, in the UK, in Germany, in Paraguay. And Darville is the main one in England. It has 300 people in it. And as you can see, it's in a very pretty place. It's in the middle of rural southern England. And it's trying to create a intentional community based on the early church. Go down, you'll get some more pictures of it. And at the heart of Darville and Bruderhof communities in general, is all of its members want to follow the teachings of Jesus to the letter. They want to live lives fully given to Christ, to pick up their Christ, to die in this life, as it were, and give everything to Christ so that they can truly live. And to do this, they have taken the radical decision, each one of its members, to live in this sort of community based on Acts 2. Now, if I just get up Acts 2, then we'll be able to see, you'll be able to hear why it will give the basis for understanding the various decisions that they've taken. So at the end of Acts 2, following Peter's sermon inspired by the Holy Spirit, where over 3,000 members joined the church, the book of Acts describes the early church as follows. Reading from verse 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So this passage describes the early church as one committed to the teaching of the apostles, that they're living in community together, eating together, worshipping together, discussing the teaching of the apostles together, and having sold all of their possessions to live in a community of goods. As you'll see, this is key to the way Darville lives. So every member of the Bruderhof, whether in Darville or elsewhere, on joining the community, takes 3 vows. One for poverty, that they will live a simple and humble life. Chastity, that they will live a sexually pure life. And of obedience, that they will be obedient to the community. And we can see how these are outworked in the structure and living of Darville. So as to poverty, well, when you join Darville, you have to sell everything you own and give up all your possessions to the community. Nobody owns anything in Darville. Rather, everything is shared in common. It's a community of goods. What this does is that it means that the community provides for everybody's needs. So all your clothing, housing, and food is provided for by the community. And you have a degree of choice within this, but within your clothing choices, for example. So you could see here, this guy has a nice leather jacket. We'll come on to women's clothing in a bit. This guy has a nice shirt, and so on. So you can see they're not wearing uniforms as such. But you have to pick something from that the community's given you. And as for food, well, you can see here, everybody eating together in community. Nobody earns a wage in Darville. Rather, everybody is given a vocation. There are leaders elected by the community, and they tell you what you're going to do. This is going to change over time, where you're needed and what for, according to what arises. You might be working in the kitchen, you might be teaching in the community school, you might be working on a farm, providing clothing that we've just been discussing, or in one of their businesses. They have a number of businesses which, while they do not operate within the Darville itself, the Bruderhof have businesses which sustain their communities. And they sell the following things to the outside world. So they have one business which creates child's toys, or toys for children. They produce equipment for the disabled, and they produce signs or signage. So you'll just get allocated one of these things, and any money that's created through this is not used to spend on one's own possessions or for the luxurious items such as buying furniture or technology. Rather, it goes to producing for the needs of the whole community, and any surplus is used in works of charity or supporting local hospitals and things like that. This ties in then with the place of obedience, that you are not just your own thing. You don't just get to choose what you do in Darvell. You're under the authority of the community, who's assigned certain leaders for various lengths of time to direct each individual for the benefit of the community. And we'll get into any disciplinary issues and how they handle rebellion in a wee bit later. But you can already see this is a very countercultural sort of society, because to have somebody in authority over us like that is totally alien to most of us in some way or another. And to deal with that direction in your life, to be told what to do, requires, well, they talk about your real vocation being a member of the community. So it's that framing in the sense of, my job isn't my vocation, it's being here. And so I'm willing to do anything for these people and be instructed as such, because that's my vocation. So it's really seeing the hierarchy as a part of the meaning of their lives. So the third vow, chastity, ties in to this also. So chastity here is sexual purity. That's before marriage. So no sexual acts before you have been married to somebody, or if you're single for the rest of your life. They recognize some people do not get married. It's quite strict, so that includes requiring permission to date. And if you are married, it means being faithful in your marriage. So nobody can go and have an affair or have a divorce. Once you're married for life. These ideas are also tied to modesty. They want to emphasize that, okay, you can't do these things, but you also have to dress appropriately and in a way that's sexually pure. So that means modest and simple clothing. This is particularly well seen on the women who wear headdresses and scarves. And there's a good, I think here it is. Here you can see these young ladies wearing this sort of plain clothing, which is a part of that modest and simple living. It's also to emphasize that all the members of the community are equal. Nobody's superior to anybody else intrinsically. Rather, there may be superiors in terms of authority, but everybody's an equal member in Christ and thus in the Bruderhof. So what about when people rebel against this community and its values? Well, one of the ways they try to prevent this is in how they deal with the youth. Because as one of the objections to academic agents' positive vision was the youth will rebel. They always rebel. So how are you going to handle this in this authoritarian kind of community? Well, the Bruderhof encourage every member of the youth, when they reach an appropriate age, maybe like 18, to spend a reasonable amount of time in the outside world. And they encourage them to do this because to be a member of the Bruderhof, you have to want to commit voluntarily. You have to subscribe to their creed, and you have to be approved by the community, and you must want to do it too. There's all these various checks. We'll go through them again in a second. But for the youth, what that means then is you're just because you're born into the community does not mean you can become a full member by birthright. You have to join yourself, age 21. So they encourage people to leave the community for a while to explore whether this is the right thing for them or not. If it is, they I imagine they celebrate that. But if not, there's a viable mechanism whereby young people can choose another life. If they make that decision, as it is the case if anybody else leaves, people do not get their property returned. It's been given to the community. However, they will give you transition funds and help you integrate into, I guess, modern society. So it is possible to leave if you're a young person. The process for somebody joining the community who doesn't have family in it is harder. So as I said, it's a process. On the one hand, a person has to discover that this is what's for them. On the other hand, the community has to accept you or judge you fit to join. This takes place through a year-long process, maybe longer, where a person becomes a novitiate of the community. They live as if they're a member. They engage in tasks. They are under the authority of the community. They dress appropriately, and so on. During that time, either party can decide it's not the right thing. So the individual can recognize this isn't for me. The community might judge at any point that you are not right for this community. Maybe it's your behavior or your beliefs or something. So there's very high entry threshold to getting into the Bruderhof. Not just anybody can sign up. People are welcome to visit. People are welcome to their hospitality. But to be a member, you have to really buy in and be approved. Once this year-long process is done and you've been approved, you may join. But again, you need to have the right beliefs and you need to have believers' baptism as well. If you then decide to leave as an adult rather than as a youth who's not become an official member, there is this transition offered, but it's more complicated. Or we could say more of a break, because when a youth leaves, they've never become a full member, as it were. That they haven't taken the vows, right? However, if a person's taken those vows, which are a lifelong commitment, and then left, they've broken their vows to God first and foremost. So that causes real tension and a real rift. Whereas the young person could later decide this is the right thing for me. Those people who have left have forsaken their role in the community. So it's very serious to leave like that. And that's partly why they have this year-long process to discern whether it is the right thing for you or not, and for the community. Once you're inside, communal life is the center of your attention. There is no social media usage for most people. They do have, interestingly enough, the Bruderhof do have some YouTube channels and like websites and things, but they're really just for promotional material. The vast majority of Bruderhof will not have Facebook or Twitter or anything like that, and probably don't watch YouTube videos. They don't have TVs either. So again, these are two similar things to Trumpton. However, and I guess like Trumpton, they're not averse to technology. So they're not like the Amish. They believe they can use technology to help them live, basically. So anything that's helpful for basic needs, that's fine. but anything averse to that, no thanks. Additionally, they have very good, strong communal life. So their entertainment then becomes through eating together in each other's houses, and they make a real effort to include single people in that, inviting them into families and so on. They have lots of community activities together. So here you go, you can see all the children playing together. And that ties in with they have their own schooling systems, or certain schools they'll send the children to at various points. They enjoy kind of productions, music, worship together. They have a healthcare system of sorts. So in the town, they'll have their own medically trained and approved doctor and nurse who can make local house calls when needed. If there's anything more serious that requires kind of a hospital or so on, they will use the NHS. Now, this might be seen as a cop-out, but they do have to pay tax. So, there is that aspect to it. But that reinforces the point. They're not averse to using technology when needs be. I think, yes, so those are the main contours of Darville. And Stanley Hauerwas, the American theologian or ethicist, has described the Bruderhof as married monasticism. And I think this is a really good description in many ways, because if you think of monastic life in the medieval era and even today, it's about men and women who commit their lives taking these 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They're an enclosed community usually, although there obviously are monastic orders who are outward looking, but Darville is an insulated community. While people can visit, only certain people can become members. The community at Darville have a very, like monks, have a certain dress code, a certain way of life, a rejection of distractions like social media and television. But unlike monks, they're married, or they encourage families. So you could say it's an apposite comparison or description. And I've seen some Bruderhof acknowledge that that is basically the case. Before I go further, I'm just going to look at the chat, and then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty points about how Darville might improve or identify certain challenges in the positive vision. So, Mongolian Doggerland, hello to you, sir. Late by about 200 years, judging by the thumbnail. Yes, they do look like they're not from modernity, and many of them actually explicitly say, like, the people who converted or joined the community, that part of the appeal was to escape modernity and the isolation of modernity. Some interviews I saw, or newspaper reports on them. So, as I said, many of the youth get the opportunity to leave Darville for a period of time to decide whether they'll stay or go. And one of them said one of the things she found most striking was that she took community for granted. But when she moved to London, there was no community at all. And she felt so lonely in London. And that's why she decided to become a full member of the Bruderhof. It was interesting, though, thinking of it in those terms, because often it's presented as, if you were given the choice to join this, think of all the things I'd be giving up. Well, for her, it was all the things she would give up if she became a participant in modern British society. And community for her was more important than all the benefits we have. I think that's really interesting. There are obviously cases of people who don't do that. There's been various documentaries. I think the BBC did one, a kind of inside look at Darville, and some people complaining about that it emotionally traumatized them because of their sexual purity, I guess. And so they preferred modern society. It's difficult to know with these sorts of cases because we're not privy to all the evidence. But certainly for those people who preferred leaving, for them, they disagreed with the values fundamentally of sexual purity, and they wanted what we have in modern Britain, where kind of tolerance of all sexual lifestyles, it seems to be the norm. And so theirs could be celebrated or positively embraced. Yeah, that was quite a tangent from me being late. Jilly, hello to you, Jilly. Jilly E, I guess. I think I'm saying that right. Yes, I wonder what AA would make of it. I'm not sure how far he would be impressed with it, to be honest. I think there's various differences. We'll come on to some of the more difficult ones later, or challenges that Darville might propose. But I think one of the obvious key differences is this community of goods is essentially a kind of, well, it isn't communist because it's in the sense that it's not based on like any Marxist teaching. It's based on Acts 2. But it's certainly, and its view of hierarchy isn't Marxist either in that sense. However, functionally, this emphasis on equality and community of goods may be something he would dislike quite intensely. Nevertheless, its traditional values and its ability to insulate itself from modernity and live a community-based, focused life with a strong sense of authority may appeal, or maybe some, and at least it shows the feasibility of some of these ideas or this way of living. I guess this was in response to everybody gives over their stuff. Yes, but as I say, many of these people choose to do this. The authorities don't. And this is one of the interesting things. The Bruderhof don't try and recruit members. They don't say everybody needs to be a member of the Bruderhof. In fact, as we'll come on to, they explicitly say, no, this isn't for everybody. So this isn't Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum trying to take our stuff away from us. Everybody there's chosen to give away their stuff. So that in itself is an interesting thing, and maybe is something we need to explore a bit further as we move on. Yeah, I guess that's true. I'm thinking through my wardrobe. Most of it's pretty plain. I agree, definitely. Cheers. Thank you, sir. I hope your work goes well. Work is the best thing we can do, or at least one of the best things in our lives. So keep at it, sir. Good to see you, Matt. Darville is the place where the Bruderhof community live. Yes, that would make sense. It's in East Sussex. So yeah, exists today in modern Britain, which is surprising. So without further ado, I think we've caught up with the chat. So let me get into some of the issues I was kind of alluding to. So Darville is a kind of monastic community in some sense, and membership's based on voluntary kind of profession or desire to join, profession of these 3 lifelong vows. And it is, how to put it? Well, if we think of medieval monasticism for a second, in a society where culturally everybody, for the most part, was Christian. Late medieval society, everybody pretty much attends church and is a member, and if not, you're probably a Jew, maybe a Muslim, but certainly in like Britain during this period, or England, I should say, pretty much the whole community attends Mass on a Sunday and would take part in communal Mass on Easter. So what role did the monastery play in that? Why did people become monks during that period? Well, there's this concept in some of the literature which distinguishes two types of conversion. There's inter-religious conversion and intra-religious conversion. So inter-religious conversion deals with a change from one religion to another. So typically in medieval society, that would be from Judaism or Islam to Catholicism, or maybe the other way around. In the Italian peninsula, you had a lot of cases of people, especially if they'd been kidnapped or taken to the Moors or somewhere like that, that they would become Muslims. Although many people did seem to have done voluntarily as well. Intra-religious conversion is of a different nature. Rather than a movement between religions, it's a movement within a religion. That is, I guess it's a kind of process or maybe an event which leads to this, which is about drawing closer to God. It's about having an awakening or a new awareness of the significance of life and trying to reorder your priorities so that you become closer to God and have communion with God. For most people in late medieval society, the best way to kind of live out an intra-religious conversion was to join one of the religious orders, a monastery or a convent, in case of women, or maybe into the priesthood or something like that. But certainly monasteries and convents were examples. And this idea of intra-religious conversion seems to be at the heart of membership of the Bruderhof. All of these people have had to choose this way of life, and they do so because they believe it will bring them closer to God. That's why they do it. That's why they give over all the possessions. That's why they reject modernity and its vices and live in this way, because they believe it so. And I think this is one of the defining features of Darville, but also identifies a problem with Trumpton, because Trumpton, when we look at membership of Trumpton for a second, I appreciate we're working on different scales. AA described it as kind of 30,000 people at one point, but I think we can look more broadly. In general, the people that are going to come to Trumpton are people who want, first and foremost, we could say, a rejection of modernity and Western liberal society, and second, some kind of traditionalism. Now, what that explicitly means, traditional or traditionalist, isn't clearly defined in the way that Acts 2 defines the church. What I mean by that is, in Acts 2, there's a clear community of goods going on, and that's why the Bruderhof have this community of goods idea. But AA is working with something called perennial traditionalism. It has its roots in primarily in Julius Evola, although Thomas Carlyle has kind of seeds of it in his vision, although it's not as fully articulated as it is in Evola. It's essentially this idea that amongst all the great world religions and societies, there is a common core and essence which refers to the eternal laws of justice, or nature, and that for community to be truly great, it needs to conform to this ideal or the laws of nature, as it were. And when we're bent out of these, we lose our way. We become corrupt. We become degenerate, our systems and ourselves. So we need a society based on these eternal laws, as it were. Now, this is all well and good in some ways. And I'm not going to present the straw man of saying, well, what does that mean in practice? Because we have a general sense from him of kind of a hierarchy with traditional moral values and sexual ethics. However, I think part of the issue here is that for at least most of the people in the community that he has around him, their unity is not in their positive vision, but in their rejection of modernity. And what Trumpton seems to be based on is that rejection of the current order in favor of an alternative. And the alternative being an end in itself. But that doesn't strike me as a strong enough core to unite people. When we look at to give up the, what would you call it, the seeming benefits or apparent benefits of the current of our current ways of living for his vision. It may work for perennial traditionalists who don't believe that any particular religion is necessary or any particular religious commitment is necessary. If you had a whole community of perennial traditionalists who were doing this because it would draw them closer to the divine, then it might have that core, that real drive, that real fundamental motivation to pursue this supreme good that can overcome all of these obstacles, that make the sacrifices worth it. Just as pursuing communion with God is the heart of monasticism and the Bruderhof. But if it's just, well, I want to live a traditional life, that's not going to be strong enough, because human nature needs something more than that. It needs, our fundamental desires need to be changed, or need to be overridden by an even greater desire for communion with God or something like that. So I think that's an issue with Trumpton, that it doesn't have that great pull, and that's why so many people resisted it initially. The positive vision is the form that needs, or it's a means to something more, and that something more is somewhat missing at the moment. And so that's one issue. And a further issue might be this. So monasticism wasn't for everybody in the medieval era. And this was explicit in its doctrine. The orders weren't trying to make everybody in medieval society a monastic. For one thing, that would just be impractical. But another reason is it was considered a particular calling to a holy life. And this was recognized by the fact that becoming a monk or a nun was seen to separate you from the profane. You were called to a holy life, as it were. You were called to live in distinction from ordinary ways of living. Hence your different clothing. Living in a building separated from the rest of the community. Your structured way of living through the day with various tasks and so on demarcated you from most people. They were held as perhaps a higher holiness than ordinary people could ever attain to. And this was okay. This was acceptable to have this division, at least in late medieval society, between the holy and the ordinary people, or the monks, the nuns, and everybody else, let's say. And that's why when monks and nuns failed in this holiness, in this sanctity, when many of them engaged in sexual activity or were greedy and so on, that's when people got really angry about it, because they were breaking the vows they had committed to for life, and were just living like other people, which got many ordinary people's made them very angry. However, we could also see this with the Bruderhof. They require voluntary membership into their community, and they explicitly say this isn't for everybody, and they recognize that salvation does not require that you join the Bruderhof. It's by faith alone for them, following Protestant doctrine and biblical doctrine. So they're not trying to say you have to become a member of the Bruderhof to be saved. So they recognize that this calling by God is only for a few, not the many. And I think that's a really important point here, that these sorts of communities, enclosed communities dedicated to a holy way of life, are not for everyone in this way. Certainly, everybody's called to live a life devoted to God and thankful, and whatever we're doing, worshipping God in all of our work and activity. But this sort of intense community, like Darville, or like a monastic community, which is enclosed and devoted to these three vows, that's not what God calls everybody to, and not possible for everybody. And perhaps the problem with Trumpton in that regard is that it's calling, by saying 30,000 people are going to be here, ordinary people, it's not reflecting that most people couldn't live like that, couldn't give up these things. It's really exceptional for that to be the case. It was people like this Teresa of Avila and Ignatius of Loyola. They are the Bruderhof are like them, rather than your ordinary person. So that might be a problem too with Trumpton, is that it's trying to appeal, even though AA would often say it's not trying to appeal to the NPC or the mass man or ordinary people, we might say, even within the kind of activist or the person who is politically engaged and has similar beliefs to him, it's still going to be a subset who are going to be capable of this way of life, of this sort of sacrifice. So those are two kinds of issues that Darville might raise for Trumpton as a concept. That as it may, let's look at some of the positives, because I think one of the things I really appreciated about the positive vision idea was just that it tried to present something, a different way of life to what most of us have, as a possibility. And that's great, because that's the heart of somebody like Carlyle, for example. When you read Carlyle, he wants to point us in a different direction for how we're living now. And to do that is more of the essence of somebody like Carlyle than just destructing the current order. So I really appreciated that, and it certainly caused a lot of conversation, which is also a good thing in that regard. So some of the positives of Darville for Trumpton. Well, it shows that it's feasible to live without social media and television. That seemed to be one of the big objections. Oh, and maybe computing in general, let's say. That seemed to be one of the big objections to Trumpton, that this isn't possible, either because we wouldn't survive, we'd live till 30 or something like that, or we can live with technology, we just have to use it rightly. Well, these people show you don't need technology in that sense, just basic minimum necessity needed technology, and they're fine. They survive to old age. People said that the government or foreign powers would invade any sort of attempt to create a traditional society. Well, Darville exists, and as far as I'm aware, the UK government hasn't tried to close it down in any meaningful sense. Now, perhaps this is because it's a Christian community, it's a pacifist community. It does work in hospitals, charities, food banks, etc., etc. So perhaps that's part of it. It's quite open. It's possible to leave. So it's not an enclosed cult. So that might be part of it. It's also not trying to challenge the ruling authorities. So Trumpton would be explicitly against modern Britain, whereas Darville isn't interested in that sort of conversation. But nevertheless, it's a traditional society, and it's not being closed down. It exists in modern Britain, which is of itself really interesting. So the feasibility argument is severely undermined by the existence of Darville. And the people that genuinely seem happy would be the wrong word, because happiness, again, is a modern concept here. But they definitely seem fulfilled, and they want to be there. And that is more than most people can say about modern society. Most people put up with modernity rather than embrace it. So it really raises the question, as a place, why don't we join? Because if it's feasible to live in this way, with kind of traditional values, an emphasis on community, a removal of unnecessary technology, it no longer becomes about whether it's practical to do it. It's rather, what are our priorities? Our priorities are going to determine then whether something like Trumpton is a good idea or not. Because if it's possible to live like this, then the only reason not to is because you don't want to. We don't think it's the best idea. So why don't we choose a society with little technology? Is it because we love technology too much, or what technology brings? Again, if it's moral values and the lack of freedom, but why do we love this liberty more than we love the stability and obedience that comes with community life? Darville highlights these are the key issues, our priorities. And if our priority is wrong, that they need to be changed, that we need to undergo an intro-religious conversion, perhaps, as I was talking about earlier. But Darville might not be the best example of an alternative to modernity, an alternative to the current order. And I think that's the other side to Darville, which might be helpful here. Darville works, I've argued, because it's based on a common commitment to God, and is really rooted in Christian community, following a model from the apostolic tradition provided in the Book of Acts. And it really works because of that homogenous culture is sustained by people who want to be a part of this homogenous culture. That's unlikely for most people, as I've argued. It's only the very few who could do that in reality. And so, both because it's essential to the core of this sort of community, and very few people could join this sort of community because of its homogeneity, somewhere like this may not be the future for most people. And that might not be a problem. Maybe that's okay. You only want what's for the few, if that's you. But for everybody else, who may be very strongly committed to being against modernity, who may be wanting something else, this isn't going to work. It could just be because you've got other commitments, other priorities, like your family, or you're doing really great work in some area. that you would have to give up to join this. Or, and I think this will probably be the case for a lot of people, you don't share the beliefs of somewhere like the Bruderhof. And to kind of construct a community on perennial traditionalism is too vague to sustain something like that. So those are just some thoughts and comments and comparisons with Darville. I really hope it's been interesting. I'm going to go through some of the chat now that's come through since that last part, and feel free to keep commenting. I hope this. I don't want to say this is like this isn't an attempt to try and give an answer. I think that's one of the frustrating things from so many of the response videos, is they attempt to provide a conclusive answer to what academic agents try to do. Whereas it's supposed to be a conversation where we're exploring ideas and trying to learn about things and learn about what we want and what might be a better alternative in general. So this isn't those points that I've made are not conclusive. They're more trying to spur on our thinking about these issues, about what really matters and what's needed to sustain an alternative vision of reality or of community. And I think it's the drive for communion with God that sustains this sort of intense community. But it might be something else that I've not thought of. So feel free to throw in your thoughts. So let's see. 99 Iron Duke. Hello to you, sir. A bit too communist for me. Yes, that is. That's the thing that makes me balk at this somewhat. Is although it's not Marxist in the sense that it's not based on Marxist ideas, it's fundamentally based on Acts 2 and the community of goods that was held then. It certainly could. It's certainly economic. Just on a pure economic analysis, would fall under the kind of communism, and that's probably going to be deeply unappealing to many people. And I can certainly really understand that. I guess my hope would be that we could maybe overlook this somewhat and see, well, many of its other features compare quite well with Trumpton. So this area we can maybe put to the sideline somewhat. Additionally, we can also see that the fact that people are told where they're going to work in this economy is quite similar to Trumpton in the sense that you have your vocation and it's given to you. You don't choose your vocation in Trumpton. You don't choose your vocation here. And it might change depending on the needs of the community. I guess one thing with Darville is it's not like a fully self-sufficient community in the sense that, okay, they may have their own farm, but they don't produce their own electricity. They don't produce all of their goods, as it were, or not the full majority per se. So perhaps, and what Trumpton was trying to do was do that, be as self-sufficient as possible. Perhaps if it was trying to be like that, then it would have to move away from a community of goods. But because it's like 300 people with a few businesses to the outside world, it can get away with it. But as soon as you increase the scale to like 30,000 with Trumpton, it's probably not going to work very well. Hence why there's 300 and not 30,000 there. Very true, Matt. And yeah, and I see you've put the verse below. It's all about what you love most, and I think that's at the heart of so much of this debate. Is about how we should structure society. Is what do people love most, and what they love most determines what they're going to include and exclude, whether they're willing to give up all their wealth to join somewhere like the Bruderhof, or if they love other things, perhaps. They are pacifists, for sure. They are opposed to any killing whatsoever, is what they say, for any reason. And I'm reminded of something that J.R.R. Tolkien said in one of his letters. I forget which one, I'm sorry to say. But he points out that, Tom Bombadil, he lives in exclusion. He has his own little kingdom, as it were, his garden, and he loves life there with Goldberry. And he's insulated from the evils of the world there. And he's able to resist the power of the ring, for example, because he has no interest in worldly affairs. But Tolkien says that it's only because there are others willing to fight Sauron that somebody like Bombadil can exist. If there wasn't Aragorn and Boromir and Gandalf and Frodo and so on, who end up leading the cause against Sauron and destroying the ring, eventually Bombadil would have been taken too. So this is perhaps another weakness of somewhere like Darville, is it's dependent upon others for its defense. That's a notable difference from Trumpton, where AA perhaps somewhat comically was suggesting it needed its own missile defense system. But it's that sense that actually, if you're going to follow a pacifist route, you're going to depend on others for your security. And somebody's going to have to protect and have a military, whether it's you or somebody else. It's the spiritual ties and belief in God which sustains these types of settlement. Agreed, Skadi warrior. Skadi. You're very welcome here. Good to see you. I agree. It's that intra-religious conversion each of the members have, which sustains the community and thus limits it to only a select few who are going to join. It's the two things together which lie at the heart of it. So trying to expand that to a larger group is going to be difficult, or a more diverse group, I should say. Matt's saying much the same thing. I guess traditionalism might be the means by which we find God, and if I was to take, if we take Trumpton at its most charitable, that's kind of the idea. It reconnects us, I think, in what AA would say with the eternal laws of nature. These might be revealing God. So we could see it as a means to an end, but the problem is it's the way it's presented, or it's an end in itself, and so it can't sustain itself. Because when it looks impossible to keep going, you've got nothing else to fall back on. There's no desire for something stronger. The modern world wants you to have faith in worldly things, which are ultimately dust and nothingness. Very much agree. I think our crowd know what we don't want more than what we do want. That's the fly in the ointment. Yes, and it's a difficult problem. That's one of the good things about the positive vision discussion, is that it at least help people to think about what we do want, or what people do want. What do we want? Do we want what we've got at the moment? Do we want a slightly altered version of what we've got in the moment? Or do we want something radically different? And it's not just about belief, it's about what's often described as revealed preference, right? What would you actually do? What do you desire most? And if our beliefs and our desires don't match up, then do we need to undergo some kind of intra-religious conversion or not? And if so, how do we get there? These are all these sorts of questions we need to be asking. What do we want most? And I guess that's partly the challenge Darville poses for Trumpton, but also how it helps to improve it, beyond just showing its feasibility and how it could deal with the youth and so on. AA would not and could not live in Trumpton himself, and I think he's admitted just as much as that, which is a very interesting point about, again, going back to what's just been said about belief and revealed preference, or fundamental desire being the key and not just what we think and what we're reacting against. It's about what we're staking our life on. And that's something that I've personally found quite difficult, actually, in this whole the debate that's gone on, is that there's people vociferously arguing for something like Trumpton who have no desire to live in somewhere like Trumpton, who just want other people to give up everything for it. At the same time, there's other people critiquing it without really considering their own fundamental desires. I think particularly of people who are saying, well, we can live just as we are, but with a bit more authenticity. I think, well, what do you truly desire in that? Unless there's a real attempt to change ourselves first, which is what Carlyle argues for. He doesn't think that the solution comes from putting in new rulers with new laws. It comes first and foremost through the reformation of the self, which is deeply painful. But when we as individuals are aligned with God or the supernatural or the eternal laws of nature, then we will be able to create and live in the society that's better than what we've got at the moment. So perhaps part of the issue is we've got the cart before the horse. We're looking at a positive vision before we're capable with the sorts of people that can live in a positive vision. Perhaps. And maybe somewhere like Darvell with the Bruderhof highlight that to us, that we need to be those sorts of people if we're going to have these sorts of conversations seriously. Or perhaps we need to have a different positive vision, which is less ambitious, reflecting what we genuinely desire, and isn't some kind of monastic community, which would require the sacrifices we're not willing to take. Because certainly, I mean, preparing this stream has forced me to think about, is Darville the sort of place I could live? And it's really difficult because it really does appeal. It's that total commitment to live in a life worshipping God in a community like that seems very appealing. But then part of me thinks, well, I have these other desires that wouldn't be satisfied in such a community probably. I love discussion like this. I love reading and listening to Beethoven. I love going for walks where I would like to go for walks. Just simple things like that, which are those good desires, though? Are those the sorts of desires that I should prioritize? If I feel that way, I don't have a strong enough desire for somewhere like the Bruderhof. Do I need something? So do I need to change? I don't know those answers yet. But certainly those are the sorts of the questions that these sorts of discussions should be eliciting from us, or could elicit from us. And maybe that would help progress the conversation more towards what we might seek to live in, rather than the kind of hysterical reaction we saw from many people towards what was essentially a thought exercise. So that's the last of the comments. So all that remains to be said is thank you once again for joining, whether you are listening live or to it recorded. I'm really very greatly appreciate your time and for your input. I look forward to hearing what other people have to say, and if there's any kind of further thoughts on this. But more broadly, I just want to encourage you to think about whether or not it's Darville or Trumpton or anything else, regardless of what the positive vision is, what do you most fundamentally desire? And to really think about that and start from there. I'm going to try and do that more. And hopefully it can inform our thinking about these sorts of questions. Till next time, may God's grace and peace be with you all. God bless.